Hello my friends and colleagues, this is not a typical video, so I'm not going to be doing a typical intro today, but don't worry, you're all still my chooms. Now, this is a hair loss channel, but as you chooms know, I occasionally delve into other aspects of healthcare, including things like skincare, diet, and even longevity with my Brian Johnson videos. This is actually popularly requested amongst my viewers. They often will tell me things like, "But Kevin, you're so good at breaking down scientific research, so why do you limit yourself to just talking about hair loss, bro? Why not talk about nutrition or something else?" That's a good question, my fellow hair loss witchers, and it is one I am happy to answer. The first reason why is because this is first and foremost a hair loss channel. Nutrition-related subjects on YouTube are already very oversaturated, no pun intended. So if I were to make my channel about nutrition, then my channel would be like a drop of water in a vast ocean. It would barely make a ripple no matter how good my content was. Hair loss, on the other hand, is still a fairly niche subject on YouTube, and even though there are definitely other hair tubers out there, it isn't nearly as popular of a subject as nutrition. So I feel by covering hair loss, I have a better chance of having my ideas gain traction, especially since hair loss is a subject that is filled with so much misinformation, just like nutrition. The second reason why is because nutrition is definitely a culture war battle for many people. What people choose to eat is a very personal decision that people will get very emotionally attached to, and they'll get very angry when they're told that they're wrong. So I think when people go on YouTube to look up information on nutrition, they're not actually trying to find anything that challenges them to think critically, they're just seeking affirmation for whatever kind of diet they're following. But as someone who is probably a bit older than your average social media influencer, I'm nearly in my mid-40s after all, I can't help but notice how the trajectory of people's perception of what constitutes good nutrition has shifted so much in the past couple of decades. For instance, in the 1990s, I remember the nutrition boogeyman back then that everybody was afraid of was saturated fat and cholesterol. Everywhere you'd look, you'd see products bragging about how low fat they were. I remember Subway even used to brag about how their sandwiches only had 6 grams of fat or less, and they positioned themselves as being the healthy fast food choice for health-conscientious people due to its low fat intake. We were told to stop eating the egg yolk. Movie theaters were told to stop putting coconut oil in the popcorn. We even had Fabio who told us things like this.
She wanted to remember the love they shared for butter, but cholesterol took away their passion until...
I can't believe it's not butter.
I can't believe it's not butter. The taste you love without the cholesterol.
What a work of art.
These days, though, the pendulum has definitely swung in the other direction. It has swung dramatically. The way people talk about nutrition today would have been seen as satire if it were talked about in the 1990s.
Has he asked for anything special?
Yes, this morning for breakfast. He requested something called wheat germ, organic honey, and tiger's milk.
Oh, yes, those are the charmed substances that some years ago were felt to contain life-preserving properties.
You mean there was no deep fat? No steak or cream pies or hot fudge?
Those were thought to be unhealthy.
We have social media influencers who are eating cold sticks of butter. We have Jordan Peterson and his trad thought daughter who claim to live on a diet consisting of nothing but steak, salt, water, and Andrew Tate. We have YouTube doctors who are telling us that saturated fat and cholesterol don't cause heart disease. Many nutrition influencers are now telling us that high cholesterol is even good for us and that people who are taking statins, which are drugs designed to lower their cholesterol, are actually hurting their health by doing so. Also, another dramatic change in the nutrition narrative is the discussion about vegetables. When I was a teenager in the 1990s, I was told to eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. Even in 6th grade, I remember my health class teacher said that every day we should try to incorporate lots of fruits and vegetables in our diet because they have a lot of phytochemicals in them that help us fight off diseases. And this goes way back before the 1990s too. Even Popeye told us spinach was good for us, and that cartoon was from the 1930s. But these days, we're told by many social media influencers that plants are toxic for us and that they're slowly poisoning us. So all the vegetables I was told were healthy back then while growing up, like spinach, kale, tomatoes, broccoli, and even potatoes, are now considered toxic by many health influencers. The talking point they commonly use is that since plants can't defend themselves in the wild, they've developed phytotoxins as a defense mechanism to protect themselves from herbivores.
So why would cutting out the greens be good for some people? The simple fact is that the animals we eat will try to protect themselves by running away. Plants can't run away, so they have to protect themselves by attempting to poison whatever eats them.
I guess they're doing a pretty shitty job at that though, since 73% of animal species on planet Earth, including human beings, consume plants. Now, to be fair, there are definitely some plant species that are legitimately poisonous for us, like the hemlock plant or the deadly nightshade plant, but one has to wonder, if we weren't meant to eat plants, then why do fruits taste so good? Fruits are the only food found in nature that tastes good in its natural state. A lot of people like the taste of meat, but only after it's cooked and seasoned, but fruit on the other hand tastes good with no preparation. You can pick an apple directly from a tree and it already has a sweet and pleasant taste. It turns out there is a good reason for that. It's because fruits want to be eaten. Fruits contain plant seeds, so when herbivores eat them, they crap out the seeds, which helps spread the plant organism. That's why there are no carnivorous ape species. Most apes are either herbivores or omnivores, and they all like to eat fruit. So, it's no surprise that human beings, being close relatives of animals like gorillas, chimps, and orangutans, like to eat fruits too. Also, a lot of these phytotoxins and anti-nutrients that health influencers like to fearmonger about, like lectins, oxalates, or phthalates, are either not found in sufficient enough quantities to be harmful, or they're broken down in preparation, or they're actually good for you, or at least their positives outweigh their negatives. A lot of this anti-plant rhetoric comes from this book written by this asshole named Dr. Gundry. What's especially shameful about this Dr. Gundry fellow is that unlike most of these health influencers on social media who call themselves doctors but are actually just naturopaths or chiropractors like Eric Berg, for example, Dr. Gundry is actually a real doctor, which is downright embarrassing, especially since he has also defended smoking. He thinks tomatoes will kill you, but smoking is good for you. So, through this kind of social media misinformation, the narrative on nutrition has changed over the decades dramatically. Plants, which were once thought to be beneficial for your health, are now considered poisonous, and saturated fat and cholesterol, which were once thought to be detrimental for your cardiovascular health, are now seen as essential for good health and nutrition. At the same time, cholesterol-lowering medications like statins are now considered dangerous. So, who is right here? Is it the cholesterol deniers like Andrew Huberman, the Petersons, Steak and Butter Gal, Ken Berry, What I've Learned, or Eric Berg? Or is it the anti-cholesterol warriors like Fabio, who was most famous for starring in the video game Iron Sword for the Nintendo Entertainment System? I love that game. Well, I'm here to tell you that the Giga Chad Fabio was right all along. Saturated fat and cholesterol are to your heart what DHT is to your hair follicles. All these cholesterol denialists are just as stupid as the people who say that DHT doesn't cause hair loss, and most of the time, they're actually the same people. I mean, just look at the Ray Peat forums. A lot of people like to laugh about how we view nutrition back in the 1990s, but the truth is that we should have listened to Fabio, because what he said about health and nutrition back in the 1990s was correct, at least for the most part. There were a couple of things that we did get wrong back then, like believing trans fats were a suitable alternative to saturated fat, which it isn't since trans fats promote heart disease. And also, a lot of the low-fat stuff sold in the 1990s was just full of processed sugar, so we were just replacing one bad thing for another. But none of that changes the fact that what we were told about saturated fat and cholesterol in the 1990s was 100% accurate, and people should go back to listening to the experts like Fabio who warned us about how bad butter was 30 years ago.
She was coming home to the jungle and to their wild, untamed love for butter, cut down by cholesterol, until...
Darling, look what I've brought back.
I can't believe it's not butter.
Today, right-wing crunchy moms and culture warriors who are scared of GMOs and vaccines dominate the nutrition narrative. They've forgotten the lessons that Fabio taught us back in the 1990s, so now they deny that there is a link between saturated fat and cholesterol causing heart disease. They've effectively changed the narrative through social media, and what was once considered a fringe belief is now the mainstream position, at least in the popular press and in social media. Today, most people without any background in medicine or nutrition are convinced that the narrative from the 1990s about saturated fat and cholesterol was all wrong. They think we're not eating enough of it, and usually they'll try to justify this belief in one of 5 ways. I'll list these ways and briefly say why these justifications are all wrong. Don't worry, I'll expand upon these points fully later. Number 1. They'll outright deny that consuming saturated fat and cholesterol raises serum cholesterol levels. So they won't necessarily claim cholesterol is good for you, but they'll deny that diet plays any significant role. Now, it's true that there are other factors like genetics that determine serum cholesterol levels, but diet definitely does play a role too, especially when we are looking at extreme diets like the carnivore diet. Number 2, they'll say diets high in saturated fat and cholesterol do raise serum cholesterol, but that's actually a good thing because cholesterol does all these awesome things and that high cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease. That's utter bullshit, of course, and we'll debunk that claim thoroughly later in this video, but let's move on to number 3. Number 3, they'll say we're looking at the wrong type of cholesterol. For example, they'll say it's not the LDL cholesterol that's important, it's the LDL subparticles that are important. For example, here's what popular keto health influencer Jimmy Moore has to say on the subject.
Number 3 is failing to understand the varying LDL subparticles, and we're very lucky in America we can run these subparticle tests. But if you have those cholesterol levels like we were just talking about with the HDL over 1.8 and the triglycerides under 1.8, you're probably going to have mostly those large fluffy kind of LDL particles. The problem that comes into play is the very small, dense, BB-sized LDL particles, and those are indicative of a high-carb diet with very high triglycerides and very low HDL cholesterol. But doctors aren't talking about subparticles.
Jimmy Moore is one of the original pioneers of the keto diet, and he is widely regarded as one of, if not the most influential low-carb, high-fat diet promoters of all time. He is loved and cherished by virtually everybody in the keto and carnivore dieting communities. Fellow hair loss witchers, this is what Jimmy Moore looks like. I rest my case, and I wish I could say that being a fat health influencer was the worst of his crimes, but it wasn't, not by a long shot, and I'm not going to say any more about that, but I will be showing why LDL cholesterol is still the biggest predictor of heart disease rather than the subparticles he is talking about. Number 4, they'll say that even if high cholesterol is associated with heart disease, this is just a correlation and not a causation, and there is no proven mechanism to show that cholesterol and saturated fat play a causative role in the promotion of heart disease, and because of that, there is no point in lowering cholesterol levels. Now, assuming that correlation implies causation can be a logical fallacy, but we'll soon see that the evidence for elevated blood cholesterol causing heart disease does indeed meet the higher burden of proof required to show causation. Number 5, even if statins lower the risk of heart disease, it is not because they lower cholesterol, it is because of some other mechanism like anti-inflammatory effects. This too is false, and there is data showing that the benefits of statins are directly linked to their cholesterol-lowering effects. So I must confess that I was a bit reluctant to do this video because the idea seemed overwhelming to me. I mean, how could I possibly debunk all these cholesterol denialists on YouTube? There are more cholesterol denialists on YouTube and TikTok than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy, grains of sand on Arrakis, or adipocyte cells in Jason Blaha. It seemed logistically impossible. So I decided that the best way to tackle this beast of a topic is just to go over the history of cholesterol denialism in chronological order. So, let's go way back to the 1950s after World War II. It was an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity. After the great loss of life the world experienced during World War II, people started to become very interested in their health and longevity. Back then, the average life expectancy in the United States for men was only in the mid-60s, and the single biggest cause of death had become heart disease as it is still today. I say had become because in the past, it wasn't heart disease that was the biggest killer of humans. Up until the 1920s, it was actually infectious diseases like tuberculosis and pneumonia that were the biggest causes of death of the human organism. Fortunately, with the development of antibiotics and vaccines, infectious diseases became less of a problem over the years, and these days it is rare for someone to die from an infectious disease outside of the developing world. Unfortunately though, even though death from infectious diseases was going down, at the same time, the amount of death related to heart disease was increasing dramatically. People became very aware of this in 1955 when the President of the United States at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, suffered a major heart attack. Because of this increased awareness, both doctors and regular people were beginning to suspect that maybe everyday habits that we take for granted might have something to do with this dramatic increase in heart disease that was occurring across the population. One habit was cigarette smoking. Cigarette smoking was very in vogue in the 20th century. This is very apparent from the movies of that era when almost everybody smoked, and it was considered to be glamorous for both men and women. The cigarette industry claimed that smoking was healthy, and they even recruited doctors to do smoking advertisements, insidiously enough. However, the real scientists who were not on Big Tobacco's payroll were doing experiments which showed that tobacco caused cancer in animals. In 1954, the first study showing a relationship between cigarette smoking and death was published. The study included 187,766 men, and it showed a clear-cut correlation between smoking and death rates. The tobacco industry fiercely resisted this scientific data for many years. They claimed that correlation did not equal causation, and there was no evidence to show that tobacco played any causative role in diseases which kill humans. But as the scientific data continued to come in, the tobacco industry's narrative eventually collapsed, especially as more data came out that showed that smokers who quit smoking had a reduced risk of death. So finally, in 1964, the Surgeon General reported that cigarettes were hazardous to human health, and eventually, cigarette advertising on TV was banned. Now, I know what some of you are thinking right now, but Kevin, why are you even talking about smoking, bro? I thought this video was about butter and cholesterol. Get to the point, bro. Well, the reason I bring up smoking is because after it became clear that smoking was at least in part responsible for the epidemic of heart disease, researchers began to search for other lifestyle habits that could potentially be hazardous to health, and one of these lifestyle habits was diet. And what's especially remarkable about yesterday's tobacco defenders is their rhetoric matches today's critics of the so-called cholesterol hypothesis nearly verbatim. They use literally the exact same tactics that the tobacco industry used for decades to deny the health risk of smoking. Like I already mentioned earlier, they frequently bring up that correlation does not equal causation. However, correlation often does occur because of causation, and when you combine many different forms of evidence like animal studies, randomized controlled human trials, and interventional studies, it is definitely possible to show causation, just like what was done with showing tobacco causes lung cancer and heart disease. We'll get into that evidence a little bit later, but hopefully you see my point how you can't just ignore correlation and assume there is no causation. The tobacco industry scoffed at the scientific data by citing counterexamples, like saying that there are people who smoke every day and live to be 100 years old. The cholesterol deniers do the exact same thing today, saying things like there are people with high cholesterol levels who live very long lives. The big problem with that argument, though, is that there are always outliers in every argument, but most people are not outliers. Just by the laws of probability, most people are going to respond to cigarette smoking and elevated cholesterol levels like the average person, meaning their lives will be cut short dramatically. But anyways, let's once again go back to the time of President Eisenhower's first heart attack in 1955. At that time, there were already numerous animal studies showing a relationship between the consumption of a high-fat diet and the development of atherosclerosis. In fact, the first study in animals was done way back in 1908. In the study, rabbits developed atherosclerosis from eating a high-fat diet, like the kind of diet normally consumed by humans. That makes sense mechanistically, because what atherosclerosis is the accumulation of fats and cholesterol in the walls of the arteries. The inside of the atherosclerotic plaque is made up of lipids, meaning fats, including VLDL and LDL cholesterol, as well as cholesterol crystals. It is easy to understand that if the body has more cholesterol than it needs, the excess cholesterol tends to build up in the arteries in the form of atherosclerotic plaque. Plaques in the arteries can impair blood flow, or they can rupture and completely block off the artery, which will make blood flow impossible. Atherosclerosis is the most common cause of heart attacks, strokes, and peripheral vascular disease, as well as chest pain from the heart, which is called angina pectoris. Atherosclerosis is the most common cause of death in the world by quite a good margin. So, when President Eisenhower had his heart attack in 1955, which could have given us Richard Nixon as president much earlier, his cardiologist recommended he stop smoking, get more exercise, and switch to a low-fat diet. The recommendation to switch to a low-fat diet was made based on the work of a man who is absolutely reviled by the cholesterol denialist community today, a researcher named Ancel Keys. Ancel Keys is to cholesterol deniers what I am to the post-finasteride syndrome community. Basically, they see him as the Antichrist. So because of that, I feel some camaraderie with Dr. Keys, and that's one of the reasons I decided to make this video. What Ancel Keys is most famously known for is the diet heart hypothesis. In 1953, he first proposed that a diet high in fat and cholesterol leads to atherosclerosis and heart disease, and that modifying the diet by reducing fat and cholesterol could lead to a reduction in heart disease. His most famous study is the 7-country study, which was launched in 1958. It was a prospective study of 12,763 middle-aged men from 7 different countries. Although the initial publications from the study were released in the 1960s, it was actually a study that was conducted over 50 years. The results were consistent over the entire 50 years of the study. The study showed that there was a direct correlation between the amount of saturated fat in the diet and the incidence of coronary heart disease. As you can see here in this graph, there is a good correlation between the average saturated fat intake and the death rate from coronary heart disease in different areas of the 7 countries. A common rebuttal you hear from cholesterol denialists about the study is they'll say it's actually refined sugar consumption and not fat consumption that causes heart disease. As it turns out, the study also looked at refined sugar consumption, and there was also a correlation between excess sugar consumption and heart disease. But as you can see, it's not nearly as strong as the correlation between saturated fat consumption and death from heart disease. So you can't just cherry pick the sugar portion of the study and ignore the much stronger correlation that saturated fat consumption plays when it comes to promoting death from heart disease. Both saturated fat and refined sugar promote heart disease, but saturated fat is much worse. So anyways, based on the early results of the 7-country study, as well as the animal data suggesting diets high in fat cause atherosclerosis, the American Heart Association started recommending in 1961 that people reduce the amount of saturated fat in their diet. It wasn't too long after this that the first wave of cholesterol denialists started appearing. Cholesterol denialism back then wasn't nearly as bad as it is today, probably because there was no social media, but by the 1970s, the cholesterol denialist movement had officially begun, and would eventually lead to the complete brainwashing of human society to the point that we live in a bizarre world where fats and cholesterol are supposed to be healthy and fruits and vegetables are toxic. The most prominent of these early deniers was actually my great-uncle, a doctor named George Mann who has an uncanny resemblance to Al Lewis who played the grandpa in The Munsters. That interesting bit of history aside though, Dr. George Mann is famous for publishing an article in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 1977 called Diet Heart, End of an Era. The article attempted to debunk the link between diet and heart disease. His main objection to Dr. Keys and the diet heart hypothesis is that despite the American Heart Association's recommendations in 1961, the incidence of heart disease had not fallen, and that studies showed no difference in outcomes in people treated with either diet or cholesterol-lowering medications at that time. However, his chart of death rates that shows a plateau between about 1955 and 1970 is misleading. He just didn't wait long enough because since the 1970s, death rates from heart disease have in fact been falling. He should have suspected this from the last point in his graph that shows that the death rate has been going down. Now, this decrease in death rate isn't necessarily all due to changes in diet, but it does negate one of his major talking points. His other criticisms were that neither diet nor cholesterol-lowering medications had been shown to lower the risk of heart disease. Once again, he was just too early with his editorial. It was before we had effective cholesterol-lowering medications in the form of statin drugs. Modern-day statins lower cholesterol levels much, much more than diet or the other drugs available at the time. The drugs back then were niacin and clofibrate, which only lowered cholesterol by 15 to 20%, while statins can lower cholesterol by over 50%. And not only that, but as we'll soon see, statin drugs definitely do reduce the risk of heart disease, so that negates one of his other talking points. So the first wave of cholesterol denialists were subdued by strong evidence contradicting their rebuttal to the Ancel Keys diet heart hypothesis. But thanks to a recently discovered tool called the internet, the cholesterol denialists were about to come back with a vengeance. No matter which bullshitter you hear on YouTube who spouts cholesterol or statin misinformation, like What I've Learned, the Petersons, Hubermans, Steak and Butter Thought, Eric Berg, Sean Baker, Anthony Chafee, or whoever else, virtually all their talking points and ideas have the same origin. Whenever you look at any dietary fad, it usually starts the exact same way, with one asshole writing a shitty book. I mentioned Dr. Gundry earlier, whose pseudoscientific book, The Plant Paradox, started the fear about lectins and anti-nutrients, and you can find other examples of books creating similar hysteria within the health community. Like, for example, there was the book Wheat Belly, which suddenly caused every Whole Food shopping, stay-at-home yoga mom to suddenly self-diagnose themselves with a gluten intolerance, even though 99% of them ate gluten beforehand without any issues. Or how about in the 2000s when a lot of people suddenly decided that they've been eating the wrong foods the whole time because of their blood type? Again, it all dates to this shitty book called Eat Right for Your Type, which claimed without any scientific evidence whatsoever that the ideal foods we should be eating is based on our blood type. None of this has ever been scientifically verified, but people fell for it anyways. You might as well tell people that our diet should be based on our zodiac sign. And in fact, actually, that's already been done too. I'm not even joking. Here is the zodiac diet. You can't make this shit up. The point I'm trying to make here, though, is that every shitty fad diet starts with a shitty fad diet book, and cholesterol and statin denialism is no different. After Fabio rightfully warned us about butter and cholesterol in the 1990s, human society enjoyed a brief respite from all the pro-cholesterol propaganda. But in the early 2000s, the butter boneheads came back, and it all happened because of this doctor and independent researcher named Uffe Ravnskov. Uffe Ravnskov is the godfather of modern-day cholesterol denialism, and any talking point you hear today about cholesterol being good and statins being bad all originates from this man's book, which has the bombastic title of, quote, "The Cholesterol Myths, Exposing the Fallacy that Saturated Fat and Cholesterol Cause Heart Disease," unquote. Uffe Ravnskov is the big bang of the cholesterol denialism movement, and every cholesterol denialist influencer you see today on platforms like YouTube and TikTok, they all went down the black hole of his publications and got all their talking points directly from him. And over the prevailing years, these trashy, butter-pushing influencers have all blown up into these huge supernovas whose toxic influence has tainted every corner of the internet universe. So, if cholesterol denialism were a religion, which let's face it, it kind of is, then Uffe Ravnskov would be Jesus, and Ancel Keys would be Satan. And to that tunes, all I could say is, Hail Satan, because Uffe Ravnskov is a fucking moron. And I should also mention, by the way, since cholesterol denialists love using anecdotes, that Ancel Keys lived to be 100 years old. He's lived longer than any cholesterol denialist who has ever existed. Anyways, to better understand how cholesterol denialism became this omnipresent force in the whole health and wellness sphere of the internet, we must first examine its genesis with Uffe Ravnskov. Besides his book, which was originally published in the early 90s in Sweden, but didn't take off until it was printed in English in the year 2000, Uffe Ravnskov is the founder of a group of cholesterol deniers called Thinks. That's T-H-I-N-C-S, Thinks. This is all very typical of conspiracy theorists. They usually have a website where they expose their wacky ideas, and they usually publish a bunch of shitty books, which are cherished by crunchy moms and other tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorists. Another similar cholesterol conspiracy theorist is Nina Teicholz. Like Uffe Ravnskov, she too publishes her own conspiracy theories in sketchy medical journals and has published a book called The Big Fat Surprise. All these cholesterol deniers spend most of their time disputing real scientists who don't have their own websites or publish their own books. Instead, these real scientists continue to publish data in real medical journals supporting the link between cholesterol and heart disease. And that just absolutely pisses off phony quacks like Uffe Ravnskov and Nina Teicholz. Let's take one example. Here's a randomized controlled study that looked at the effect of a ketogenic, low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet in women on their cholesterol levels. As expected, the high-fat diet increased serum LDL cholesterol, as well as apolipoprotein B, which is a marker of atherogenic types of cholesterol. So, the high-fat diet increased all types of bad cholesterol, including the small, dense LDL cholesterol that salad dodgers like Jimmy Moore thinks is bad. The article concludes by saying, quote, "The data suggests that feeding healthy, young, normal weight women a ketogenic low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet induces a deleterious blood lipid profile. The elevated LDL cholesterol should be a cause for concern in young, healthy, normal weight women following this kind of low-carb, high-fat diet," unquote. But after the article was published, there was a letter to the editor of the medical journal disputing the findings of the study. It's by, you guessed it, Dr. Uffe Ravnskov himself. In the letter, Dr. Ravnskov says, quote, "In their study of the effect of a low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet on blood lipids, Bird and co-authors became worried because after a few weeks, the participants' LDL cholesterol increased significantly. However, they need not worry. It is correct that many studies have found an association between LDL cholesterol and cardiovascular disease, but association is not the same as causation," unquote. He concludes the letter by saying, quote, "The reason why LDL cholesterol is beneficial is most likely that LDL participates in our immune system by adhering to and inactivating all types of microorganisms and their toxic products, a little-known fact that has been documented in many ways by more than a dozen research groups," unquote. So, the authors of the original study replied to Dr. Ravnskov's letter by saying, quote, "We thank Ravnskov for his interest in our recent publication. In our study, low-density lipoprotein cholesterol and apolipoprotein B100 almost doubled in young, healthy women when they followed the ketogenic low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet. According to the European Society of Cardiology and the European Atherosclerosis Society Guidelines for the Management of Dyslipidemias," There is no longer an LDL cholesterol hypothesis, but established facts that increased LDL cholesterol values are causally related to atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, unquote. So, it seems that every time a scientific study is published that supports the link between cholesterol and heart disease, Uffe Ravnskov immediately publishes a letter to the editor disputing the study. Since there are so many articles that support the link between cholesterol and heart disease, though, Dr. Ravnskov sadly has to spend much of his precious independent research time writing letters disputing these articles. As one of the responses to his letters points out, quote, Ravnskov appears to ignore the large number of controlled metabolic studies relating fatty acid intake to plasma total and LDL cholesterol, as well as the overwhelming evidence that LDL is causally related to the atherosclerotic process, unquote. The letter then notes that Dr. Ravnskov has made the same arguments in 62 letters to the editor published over the past 20 years, and this was back in 2011. I mean, just look at all this shit. This is borderline harassment. This quack needs to get a fucking life. And I'm sure he's written a lot more letters since 2011, because the evidence supporting the link between diet, LDL cholesterol, and death from heart disease has only gotten much stronger. However, the worst thing Dr. Ravnskov did was publish this article in 2018. It's titled, quote, LDL cholesterol does not cause cardiovascular disease, a comprehensive review of the current literature, unquote. Unfortunately, this deeply, deeply flawed article was picked up by the mainstream media, with several newspapers having headlines like, quote, heart disease is not caused by high cholesterol, so taking statins is a waste of time, research finds, unquote. Fortunately, not all the newspapers were so full of gullible dipshits, because we had some great articles like this one from The Guardian, whose headline was, quote, butter nonsense, the rise of the cholesterol deniers, unquote. But it's likely that the cholesterol denialism articles caused many people to stop their statin drugs, which almost certainly resulted in some of them dying prematurely. So, these publications and social media influencers who are pushing medical misinformation have blood on their hands. In his article, Dr. Ravnskov cherry-picks his data. We will soon see what the complete picture looks like, but many people have pointed out the flaws of his analysis, like this article here. The article points out that the article by Dr. Ravnskov contains no new data. He analyzed data from 19 prior studies, but only 9 of those studies included deaths from cardiovascular disease. In addition, 2/3 of the subjects came from one study, a study that supposedly showed that lower cholesterol was associated with higher all-cause mortality. The problem is that in elderly people, low cholesterol can be a sign of chronic diseases like cancer, so low cholesterol in that setting can be a bad sign. Also, Dr. Ravnskov ignored the fact that in the study there was a significant survival benefit from being on a statin drug, which goes against his claim that lowering cholesterol is a bad thing. Also, Dr. Ravnskov just conveniently chose to ignore all the other studies that show that elderly people do in fact benefit from lowering their cholesterol levels. So Dr. Ravnskov is a phony, and his bullshit has literally killed people. I wish he were an illegal immigrant in the United States so that Trump would ship him to Guantanamo Bay because he deserves it. Ancel Keys, on the other hand, was a true pioneer with his 7-country study, and he turned out to be correct with it, and since his research pioneered the development of statin drugs, Ancel Keys has helped save millions of people's lives. He's a hero. It's easy to criticize an early study like the 7-country study, but cholesterol deniers act like nothing new has been learned since that study, which is completely false. In reality, there are now dozens of very large studies supporting Keys' original ideas. There are so many studies that the best way to analyze them is by doing a meta-analysis of the studies. A meta-analysis, for those who don't know, is a study of studies. It is a way to get the combined results of multiple studies into one study. In the pyramid of medical evidence, it is at the very top, meaning that this type of study is literally the best type of study you can possibly do since it gives the best and most valid results. It's also not very practical to analyze every individual study in a video like this, but fortunately we don't have to because the authors of these meta-analyses have done it for us already. The first meta-analysis we'll look at is this one here from 2016. This was an analysis of 49 different studies published from 1966 to 2016, and it included 312,175 participants, so not exactly a small sample size of subjects. The meta-analysis included studies of both statins and non-statin drugs for treating elevated cholesterol levels. In both statin drug trials, which are shown in the top graph, as well as non-statin drug trials shown in the bottom graph, there was a correlation between the amount of LDL cholesterol decreases and the reduction in the risk of major vascular events. Major vascular events were defined as cardiovascular death, an acute heart attack, or any other acute coronary syndrome like coronary revascularization, which means having cardiac bypass surgery, or a coronary angioplasty or a stroke. If you look at the classes of drugs versus the reduction of risk of major vascular events, you again see that there is a correlation between the amount of LDL cholesterol suppression and the reduction in the risk. You can see that there is nothing particularly magical about statins in this graph. There are other newer drugs like PCSK9 inhibitors that are even more potent in suppressing LDL cholesterol that reduce cardiovascular risk by even more than statins. The graph shows that the amount of risk reduction is directly dependent on the amount of LDL cholesterol you suppress. This goes directly against the talking point of the cholesterol deniers that statins reduce the risk of heart disease by some other mysterious mechanism besides their effect on cholesterol. The study concluded that it didn't make a difference what drug you use. If you lowered serum LDL cholesterol, you decreased the risk of cardiovascular disease. Here is another meta-analysis that actually looked at the results of coronary angiograms and analyzed how fast the blockages in the coronaries progress depending on the serum LDL level in people after they've had a heart attack. First of all, you can see that the risk of recurrent coronary events is directly proportional to the LDL level. Next, you can see in the forest plot that statins consistently reduce the risk of major vascular events. But I think the most impressive finding of them all is that the rate of progression of the coronary blockages on an angiogram is directly proportional to the LDL cholesterol level. That's right, that means the higher the LDL level, the faster the coronaries block off. But if you're still skeptical, here's another study that was conducted a year later that combined literally all the cholesterol research together to debunk the cholesterol deniers' bullshit once and for all. I'm not kidding about them examining all the research. I literally mean all of it. No exceptions. None. The researchers even say, quote, "We assessed whether the association between LDL and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease fulfills the criteria for causality by evaluating the totality of evidence from genetic studies, prospective epidemiologic cohort studies, Mendelian randomized studies, and randomized trials of LDL lowering therapies," unquote. So this is quite different from the sketchy methods used by all the cholesterol deniers who will just pick out a few studies that support their biases and ignore all the other studies. Here in this graph, you see what results all the genetic studies, population studies, and randomized controlled trials had on the effects of LDL cholesterol blood levels and on the risk of coronary heart disease. The graph shows that the lower the LDL levels, the lower the risk of heart disease. The next graph is a forest plot that shows that lower LDL cholesterol levels, whether they are related to genetics or due to any kind of drug treatment, are associated with a reduced risk of cardiovascular problems. Finally, the top part of this figure shows that the cardiovascular event rate is proportional to the serum LDL cholesterol level. The bottom part shows that the speed of progression of coronary blockages is proportional to the LDL cholesterol levels as well. The study concludes that, quote, "A critical appraisal of the evidence discussed in this review demonstrates that the association between plasma LDL cholesterol concentration and the risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease satisfies all the criteria for causality. This concordance between multiple lines of evidence, most notably the remarkable concordance between the unbiased, naturally randomized genetic data and the results of numerous randomized intervention trials using multiple different agents to reduce LDL cholesterol, provides overwhelming clinical evidence that LDL causes atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease and that lowering LDL reduces the risk of cardiovascular events," unquote. All the evidence is summarized in this table here, so if you want to freeze the video and look at it, then go right ahead. Oh, but you don't like conclusions based on huge clinical trials and you prefer anecdotes from butter coffee and bone broth slurping crunchy moms instead? Well, I'll end with this case report right here. This guy was in his 40s and he started a carnivore diet 8 months before he saw the doctor. He ate between 6 pounds and 9 pounds of cheese, sticks of butter, and daily hamburgers that had additional fat incorporated into them. So the guy presented to the doctor with these yellow nodules on his palms and elbows. Thanks to his carnivore diet, he developed a condition called xantholasma, which is when cholesterol deposits build up in his body. His cholesterol level was 1,000 milligrams per deciliter, which is about 5 times what's considered normal. Before his diet, his cholesterol was between 210 and 300 milligrams per deciliter, so it obviously wasn't just bad genetics. So if this is what his skin looked like, then imagine what his coronary arteries looked like. Hell, just imagine what his penile arteries look like. I bet even Anna Kasparian couldn't give this guy an erection. So, this has been a pretty long video, but the bottom line here is that fad diets like the carnivore diet are just stupid and dangerous, and denying that high LDL cholesterol is bad is also stupid and dangerous. The fact is that cholesterol denialism is just another conspiracy theory designed to sell shitty, overpriced books at Whole Foods and promote trashy social media thoughts like Buttergirl. There's absolutely no doubt that high LDL cholesterol is bad, that high-fat diets can raise cholesterol, and that drugs like statins reduce LDL cholesterol and can prevent heart disease as well as premature death. So that's about it. I'll get back to hair loss in the next video, but I had promised to make a video on this subject a long time ago, so I hope this video has been helpful to any of you who are confused by the conflicting messages on social media about diet and cholesterol. But the bottom line is that Fabio is right and the skankin' butter bitch is wrong. Thank you all so much for watching, Hair Loss Witchers. I'll see you all next time. God bless.